Early in 2023, the International Bulletin for Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock to 90 seconds to midnight. In my view, this is drastically understated. Many experts agree that we are closer to nuclear war than ever before in history, and every day there's another data point that escalates the situation further. The following is a timeline of the most significant events of the past year to help put in perspective just how fast this escalation has happened. November of 2021, Russia shoots down one of its own satellites. In a demonstration of its anti-satellite weaponry capability, Russia jeopardizes spaceflight for the entire planet, likely as a warning to NATO about the coming war ahead. February of 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. Sanctions are imposed by Western countries, USA and Europe begin sending small arms, and the US deploys thousands of troops to Europe as NATO activates its response force.
The first US soldiers now from Fort Bragg in North Carolina leaving for Europe to support NATO allies.
The United States bans the importation of Russian oil and begins draining its strategic oil reserve to combat rising inflation. March of 2022. The Russians claim first use of a hypersonic weapon in history in Ukraine. Businesses begin leaving Russia. Russia is disconnected from the SWIFT banking system, and the USA continues to deploy more troops to Europe. Troop totals are now in the 100,000 range. April of 2022. The Russian flagship Moskva is sunk. The Kremlin vows revenge. June of 2022. The USA begins sending HIMARS systems to Ukraine. These high-mobility artillery rocket systems are seen as a game-changer on the battlefield. This encourages more European countries to start sending weapons. July of 2022. New York sends out an irregular nuclear public service announcement, advising their population as to what to do in the case of a nuclear emergency. This catches the population off guard, as this sort of thing hasn't been seen since the Cold War. During this time, the US government commits to stockpiling $300 million worth of acute radiation sickness medication. Russia orders 24/7 military production. During this time, skirmishes continue to escalate around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. September 21st, 2022, Russia declares partial mobilization and martial law. Just 5 days later, the Nord Stream pipeline explosion occurs. Germany is now almost completely cut off of Russian natural gas. 4 days later, Russia officially annexes 4 territories in Ukraine. October 2022. The United States sends the prestigious 101st Airborne to Romania due to concerns that the conflict may spread to Moldova. Russia ramps up its air raid campaign targeting Ukrainian infrastructure in an attempt to destroy the Ukrainian electrical grid and force them to negotiations. Later that month, the Russian defense minister made emergency phone calls to all his NATO counterparts, claiming that Ukraine was planning on detonating a nuclear dirty bomb. Just days later, the Crimean Bridge was attacked. Around this time, the US officially altered their nuclear doctrine to allow for a preemptive nuclear strike on an adversary they deemed to be a threat. November of 2022, an S-300 missile hits Poland. NATO almost invokes Article 4. Europe was on the brink of going to war with Russia. It was later discovered that this was a wayward Ukraine S-300 missile. Later that month, that didn't stop the European Parliament from declaring Russia a terrorist state. In December of 2022, a Ukrainian drone attacked one of the military bases that houses Russia's nuclear weapons. This was a first ever attack on a Russian base that housed nuclear bombers. January of 2023, the USA and Europe agree to send tanks to Ukraine for the first time. The Russian oil price cap is imposed. Russia initiates the overhaul of its fallout shelters and installs anti-aircraft guns around Moscow. February of 2023, Russia officially suspends the New START Treaty, the last remaining strategic arms reduction treaty that exists between Russia and the United States. Later that month, the US fires 6 high-ranking officers that overseen their nuclear missile silos. During this time, the Russians send more nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered submarines out to sea, as well as deploy of a new class of ICBM missile called the RS-28 with the nickname Satan II. March of 2023. the US doomsday plane, the Boeing E-6 Mercury, is spotted in Europe. Around this time, pro-Ukrainian hackers target Russian media with a cyber attack in the form of a nuclear attack prank, tricking millions of Russians into thinking that a nuclear attack was imminent. Around this time, more advanced S-400 air defense systems are deployed in Moscow. The leader of the Wagner Group says, "Prepare for World War III." Romania begins moving air defense to Moldova, and Poland moves HIMARS systems to the Kaliningrad border. Poland begins barricading the borders with Belarus, and Russia takes down a USA drone for the first time in the Black Sea. Throughout this period of time, there are record military exercises happening across Europe and in France. Later that month, the International Criminal Court issues an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, as many US political officials call for regime change in Russia. Putin then decides to place tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. This prompts the United States to set out to sea numerous early warning detection systems in the Pacific. April of 2023. Due to the suspension of the New START Treaty, neither Russia nor the United States is obligated to share nuclear information. Around this time, the UK committed to shipping depleted uranium rounds to Ukraine. Russia deems this a nuclear threat. More diplomats are expelled from Russia and Baltic states. Russia officially deploys the Prometheus S-500 anti-satellite system. Most recently, government leaks implicate the United States and NATO in the training, arming, planning, and coordination of offensive maneuvers within Ukraine against the Russians. For some, this confirms the Russian accusation that they are not only at war with Ukraine, but all of NATO. On April 12th, Killnet, a pro-Russian hacker group, claimed responsibility for a series of cyber attacks that they claim paralyzed 40% of NATO's cyber infrastructure. On April 14th, the US commenced their annual command and control exercises. These simulate a full-scale war between Russia and the United States. In holding this exercise, the US ran the risk of the Russians interpreting this as an actual preparation for a real-world nuclear preemptive strike. On the same day, Russia's highest-ranking military commander, Sergei Shoigu, did a surprise inspection of the Pacific Fleet, putting them on high alert and conducting intercontinental ballistic missile tests. Throughout this week, some Pentagon leaks have claimed that a Ukrainian offensive is imminent, and that US troops may in fact be operating in Ukraine in some capacity. As was previously indicated by the US administration, these troops are only there to audit the allocations of weapons deliveries, but these leaks may be interpreted as the US actively supporting and directing Ukrainian troops by the Russians. Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian critical infrastructure continue as acts of sabotage on critical infrastructure ramp up. Only a year ago, these types of attacks on Russia were thought to surely lead to imminent nuclear escalation. Now they appear to be commonplace and normalized, which only heightens the risk of nuclear escalation. Throughout the Russo-Ukraine conflict, tension between the United States and China has also reached unprecedented levels. And in just the past week, North Korea has went silent on deconfliction communication channels. The Korean peninsula now teeters on the brink of war. Wars are also breaking out in Africa, and the tension in the Middle East is reaching a fever pitch. At the time of making this video, the crescendo of this conflict appears to be reaching its apex, and what happens next may dictate the fate of humanity. Both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky made visits to their troops on the front line on April 17th. On April 19th, British intelligence reports that a Russian vessel was spotted surveying underwater sea cables, possibly in order to sabotage the UK's energy supply and telecommunications infrastructure. On the same day, for the first time ever, a US-made drone was fired into Russia by Ukrainian forces. And finally, on April 21st, the NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg agreed that Ukraine will be able to join NATO, but only after the defeat of the Russians. The problem is, the Kremlin has said that it will never allow Ukraine to be a member of NATO and will never relinquish territory it's annexed without a major expansion of the conflict. Russia's nuclear doctrine allows for the use of nuclear weapons only when it perceives something to be an existential threat. Ukraine in NATO will be perceived as that existential threat and most certainly will lead to an intensification of the conflict. Russia is currently bracing for the long-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive along their 800-kilometer line of defenses. This video was made to illustrate just how much the world has changed in the span of a year. From a seemingly innocuous satellite shoot down to a divided world on the brink of thermonuclear war. This threat should not be underestimated and is showing no signs of slowing down. The time for preparation is nigh.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.